Hi, everybody. This is Doug Reeves broadcasting from snowy Boston. We're going to get underway in just 1 minute, but I first want to make sure that you have good audio and visual. So would you please use the question function or the chat function on your webinar box to let me know that you have good audio and good video. We'll start in 60 seconds. Thank you. Looks like we have good audio and video, so here we go. Welcome, everybody. We have guests from the United States and North America, as well as around the world. Thank you, whatever time zone you happen to be in, for joining us for this webinar on overcoming initiative fatigue, how to focus time, energy, and resources for student results. You'll find on your webinar function that there are a PDF copy of all of the handouts, which you are welcome to. In addition, I want to make sure that you have access to a number of other resources that we offer as well. The Creative Leadership Summit will be happening in Boston at the end of June. We welcome people from the US. We already have guests from Asia coming, as well as from the Gulf states. So wherever a home happens to be for you, please come to Boston in June. It's one of the best times of the year. And you'll hear from leading educational researchers and leaders around the world to talk about what matters most for student achievement. It's a small and intimate group held right downtown in Boston. You'll also have the opportunity to join me in my home for an evening. So I hope that you'll consider joining us June 26th through 28th, 2019. The QR code right in front of you will take you to the registration form, or you could just go to creativeleadership.net and that will take you right to where you want to be. Now, some learning protocols. First of all, I want to make sure that everybody has access to questions, not just for this event as learning, but to follow up as well. So you can use the question function on GoToWebinar. I've also given you my personal text address. The international code is 1, then 781-710-9633. That will go directly to me, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions and challenges that you may have. So let's get ready to begin. First of all, some free resources. I've published a weekly blog post, and I hope you'll consider looking at some of those at creativeleadership.net. But a couple that have had really significant attention from our friends and colleagues in the world of education is number 1, time-saving strategies for busy teachers, and number 2, dramatic turnaround in 1 semester. With respect to time-saving strategies for busy teachers, there's no gimmicks here. These are things that I've used myself and that I've seen used personally, because of all the things that teachers are concerned about right now. The number 1 challenge is we've got the energy, we've got the professionalism, we've got the learning, we just don't have the time. And you'll see strategies in this blog post, time-saving strategies for busy teachers, that people with even more than 200 students as a class load have been able to use to save them time, to accelerate the time that feedback gets back to students, and to keep their own batteries charged. Friends, I'm actually worried about you. I want you to have time on weekends and on evenings for yourself, for your families, for personal renewal and restoration. And you can't do that if you're taking home 200 papers to grade every weekend. These are ways to save you time. Please check it out. And the other thing is dramatic turnaround in 1 semester. Dr. Bob Aker and I just finished a book that will be in publication later this year called The 100-Day Leader. And our fundamental case is, yes, we know that a lot of people say systemic change takes years, but our kids don't have years. Our colleagues don't have years. They want to see some short-term wins that will restore faith that if they follow some of these ideas, they can have an impact in 1 semester. This blog post, Dramatic Turnaround in 1 Semester, will let you know how. So go to creativeleadership.net. You'll find free videos, free tools, free articles and research, all available for your use, and they're there to be shared with others as well. In addition, we offer the free resource called finishthedissertation.org. Did you know that 69% of doctoral candidates never finish? We designed this to provide free, non-commercial, one-to-one support for doctoral candidates. We started literally in downtown Boston. We now have students all around the world. So as always, we begin with some brand new research. So take a look at this and let's see how we can serve you. This I'm indebted to the researchers at the New Teacher Project for publishing this. You can find at the New Teacher Project the detailed report, but let me give you the highlights from 2019. 94% of high school students aspire to college. Bully for them. More than half of them are making A's and B's. Bully, bully for them. The problem is only 17% have mastered grade level content. This is consistent with a paper that I published called the honor roll myth, where we are telling kids with honor roll grades that they're ready for college when in fact they are not. Now, why? Is it because the kids can't handle it? No. It's because in this TP study, 40% of classes that had a majority of low income and minority students never received a single grade level assignment. Friends, they'll never master grade level content if we don't ask them to. And the tragedy is that we've got a lot of kids earning A's and B's, earning honor roll grades that are not even being asked to do grade level work. No wonder that they think they're set up for success in college, and in fact, we're setting them up for failure. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. This same splendid study said that students who started the year well below grade level, but started receiving grade level instruction, were able to close the gap with their peers within 6 months. I'm not saying it's easy, I'm not saying it's immediate, but I'm also saying it doesn't take 5 years. Within the same year, with focused, intentional grade level instruction, accurate feedback, so when they're not meeting our expectations, they know what they need to do to improve it, they can close the gap. So here, my friends, is my challenge to you. Look at real student work. Don't go back and do the song and dance about high expectations. Everybody claims they have high expectations. What I want to challenge you to do is to do what I've done, and that is to look at real student work. And don't look at the best, don't look at the worst. My suggestion, if you have marks of A, B, C, D, and F, is look at work that has marks of C and B. You know, a kid who gets a C or a B thinks that they're ready for the next level of work. And ask yourself, is this grade level work? I've been looking at a lot of C and B work, and where the top students in the class may be ready to go on, the work that's earning grades of C and B that signal to the student, their parents, and to the teacher in the next grade level that they're ready, that work earning grades of C and B is clearly not the quality of grade level work. And I want to push back. Instead of saying B, above average, or C, average, sounds pretty good, we need to say the truth. Not ready for the next level of instruction, needs more work, needs to be rewritten. You know, kids can take feedback. If the feedback is accurate, if the feedback is honest, if the feedback is immediate, if the feedback is constructive, so that it's not a death sentence, but something that I can use to get better and better. And the evidence is clear that a lot of kids aren't getting grade level work, and even if they are, they're submitting work that is substandard, and we're not calling them on it. Some more new evidence from 2019. These are things that my colleagues and I have done. Some of this literally as recent as last week. We're talking, if you're looking at this on recording, February of 2019. We're looking at high schools with very substantial reductions in failure rates. And interestingly, individual classes have had big gains, 80, 90% reductions in failure rates, but school-wide dramatic reductions in failures. Middle schools with improvements in absences, behavior, and failures. Elementary school, dramatic improvement in attendance and improvements in proficiency. Here's the key, friends. No changes in students, teachers, or curriculum. It's what you do. It's our professional practices that make a difference. And from this new 2019 evidence, you want to take away one phrase that describes it. It's practices, not programs. It's what you and I do, not what we buy. And what I'm seeing is more and more schools and systems that have bought one thing after another after the other. They are drowning, as we will discuss today, under the weight of initiative fatigue. And what we have to do is to be able to relieve them of that burden so that they can do the following. Have immediate intervention. By immediate, I mean the same day, not at the end of the semester, not a warning at 6 weeks. I mean every day, every week. If they need immediate intervention for academic support, they get it. Same minute intervention, and by that I mean the principal who has taught me about the 60-second report, where 60 seconds after the bell rings in the morning, he has a list of every student who's not there. Maybe they're tardy, maybe they're absent, we don't know, we just know that they're not there. And anyone not in front of students is sitting there on a phone in the principal's office making calls. In the first 20 minutes of the day, every single student is called. Sometimes they're asleep, sometimes their parents are asleep. But friends, this is not robocalls in the afternoon. This is not the admin person calling in the afternoon. This is the first 15 or 20 minutes of the day getting into contact with these students. So finally, from our friends in Florida, a very interesting report, February 25th, 2019 in the New York Times. When report cards were sent out on Fridays, child maltreatment increased on Saturdays. That means that when there were confirmed reports of physical abuse, the results provoked conversations about spanking and discipline and about school achievement and behavior. Now, we want to have constructive conversation with parents, but that requires us to be part of those conversations. Send the report cards home on a Tuesday or Wednesday. Provoke conversations immediately with parents during the week. Please, for goodness sake, don't send them home on Friday where the kids have got to face the music on Saturday. Now, also from February 20th, 2019, the New York Times reports a staggering increase in teen depression and anxiety. 70% of teenagers saw mental health, anxiety, and depression as a big issue. In fact, more kids are focused on anxiety and depression than on bullying, drug addiction, or gangs. And kids who are from low-income families most likely to be susceptible to anxiety and depression, although those diseases affect students across economic, social, and ethnic strata. We've got to be really clear that anxiety and depression are influencing our teenagers, and we've got to be clear about what we're doing to either support it or sometimes to aggravate it. So now let's shift into gear about what you came here today for, and that is the Initiative Fatigue Challenge. Hang on just 1 minute while I adjust the screen. So here's the Initiative Fatigue Challenge. I want you to take a moment to think about the initiatives that you've started in the last 2 years, the initiatives that you've terminated in the last 2 years, and then let me know if list number 1 is greater than list number 2. Take about 60 seconds and apply that to your own school, department, or district. I'll be back here in 60 seconds. About another 30. Now, friends, if you're kind enough to invite me to your district, I can tell you that this is one of the activities that we'll do. I literally ask people to write out the initiatives that they've got pending right now, and it is always a longer list than the administration thinks. I ask teachers to do this, principals to do this, department heads, people in the central office. The sheer quantity of initiatives that we keep adding and adding and adding almost always outstrips those that we have terminated, because it is really hard, for reasons that we shall see later on, to ever terminate these things that we start. So how do we save money and time? The answer is the impact insight process, sometimes colloquially called the implementation audit. Here's what we do. It's 3 simple steps. Number 1, take the initiative inventory. And that's simply a list of every single instructional and leadership initiative. Now let's define terms. What do we mean by initiative? These are programs, activities, or actions that are intended to improve student achievement. So for example, if we're talking about discipline, maybe you have restorative practices, maybe you have positive behavior support. If you're talking about literacy, maybe you have readers or writers workshop. Whatever the case is, we want to identify what the initiatives are. So make a list of all of them. I've been in schools that literally there are half a dozen different competing literacy initiatives in the same school at the same time. Half a dozen different data analysis initiatives, same school at the same time. List them all out. Number 2, develop an implementation rubric. Now, that's where maybe my colleagues and I can help, because it's never a binary yes-no system. People will say, well, we're doing writer's workshop. That's great, but it's never an on or off proposition. It ranges from, in our parlance, from 1 to 4. 1, to be brief about it, might be the boxes have been delivered, but we haven't opened them yet. And 2, well, all the teachers got trained. I hear that all the time. We implemented it because they got trained. I look for evidence in the classroom, it's not there. So level 1 is unopened boxes. Level 2, we went to training, no evidence of action in the classroom. Level 3, they not only were trained and have the materials, but there's evidence of implementation in the classroom. That's great. That's where most people stop. But level 4 is the gold standard. They got the material, they have the training in professional learning, coaching, whatever it is. Level 3, there's evidence of implementation in the classroom. And level 4, there's evidence of impact on student achievement. Now that, to me, is where we have to persist, or we might as well not do it. Because if it doesn't have an impact on student achievement, then I wonder what in the world we're spending the money and time on. So we assess this degree of implementation and the impact on achievement. And this 3-step process will allow you to analyze every single instructional initiative and leadership initiative that you have. Most people stop at, we got the training. They never go to evidence of implementation, and they certainly don't go to evidence of impact on student achievement. And that's where we really have to persist if you want to have a process that will help you save money and time. So how do we make that happen? We do it with focus. Now, when we are not focused, when we suffer from initiative fatigue, what you see before you is what happens. We lose empathy because different people are pursuing different things. We lose efficacy, the belief that what we do matters, because it feels to teachers and to administrators like we're just playing whack-a-mole. Every time a problem comes up, I'll hit this one, oh, then another one comes up, then another one comes up, and we lose our ability to believe that we have an impact on student achievement. We suffer under the weight of initiative fatigue, and of course that leads to frayed relationships as we ask teachers to do more and more and more, and yet they don't see that we have anything to show for it. However, if you take the advice of today's seminar and actually focus on fewer things, I got to be honest with you, there's a cost of that too. When people focus on a few things that have the greatest impact on student achievement, you'd think, wouldn't that be a good thing? Well, not always, because they feel that they're losing connection with all the other things that are going on. Well, my friend, my colleague, my classmate, they went to a seminar, they went to an institute, and they're doing all these things and leaving us behind. So my significance is diminished. I'm being left out. And when all these things are happening around me and I'm focused on a few things, I can feel less and less significant all the time. So where does the balance go? More fragmentation or more focus? Well, let me be specific. Focusing on a few things leads to a significantly greater impact on student achievement. Here's our friend Archimedes, who said, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I can move the earth. And indeed, ask an AP physics students, you can. The lever will be billions of kilometers long, but you can in fact move the mass of the earth if you had a fulcrum conveniently there to place it on. However, notice in this illustration where the fulcrum is. It's really close to what we're trying to move. And my concern is that a lot of change in schools, the fulcrum is far away from the classroom. It happens in the cabinet room, excuse me, in the boardroom, in many places far away from the classroom. If you want to move the world of the classroom, you have to be very close to what you're trying to move. So, staying with this Archimedes principle of leverage, don't just ask what works, because as John Hattie says, everything with a pulse works. Ask instead, what has the greatest leverage on student achievement? Let me illustrate with 3 examples. Nonfiction writing. It's one of the highest leverage activities out there. Writing to describe, writing to persuade. And friends, this starts really early. First graders can write to describe, write to persuade. And the evidence that I've accumulated says that when we do more nonfiction writing, we have greater results, not just in writing, we have better results in reading comprehension, better results in mathematics, better results in science and in social studies. It's one of the highest leverage, most powerful activities that we have. And yet a lot of people hesitate to engage in that because they think, well, wait a minute, Doug, our kids are struggling with reading. How could you possibly expect them to engage in nonfiction writing? In fact, nonfiction writing, writing about what I've been reading, is a great way to improve reading comprehension. I grieve about the fact that we have middle and high school students who can apparently read fluently. They sound pretty good. They've been faking their way all through school, but ask them to tell you about the contents of a paragraph that they just read, or maybe at a more sophisticated level, offer an alternative point of view to what they just read, so they have to know the point and the counterpoint, and they cannot do it. Nonfiction writing, writing to describe, compare, persuade, high leverage activity that we ought to be doing in every class. Professional learning communities, however, not just any old professional learning communities. The last article that Rick Dufour wrote before he passed away, he co-wrote with me, and the title was The Futility of PLC Light. Lots of people think that they're doing professional learning communities, but what Rick and I were concerned about is people who have the label of PLC on meetings, the label of PLC on their school or on their system, but they're not asking the 4 questions. They don't have collective ownership. They don't have common formative assessments. They don't have the many, many levels of essence of what professional learning communities are. Now, the research that I conducted with 10 years of PLC data concluded the following. Those professional learning communities that had the greatest depth and duration had the greatest impact on student achievement. Specifically, I looked at literacy, mathematics, and science. And when I say depth and duration, what I mean is they implemented PLCs deeply and held themselves accountable for the content of those collaborative team meetings. Moreover, those who had been at this for 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years did significantly better than those who were just starting. The problem is, and you know if you've seen the revolving door of leadership, how many leaders started professional learning communities saying, we're going to do PLCs, and 2 years later, that leader is gone. A new one comes in and says, oh, we've done PLCs, let's go on to something else. Friends, if professional learning communities is who you are, as Rick would say, the central organizing description of who we are as individuals and organizations, then that doesn't change with the revolving door of leadership. It is who we are, and it continues year after year after year. Remember the evidence, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. You'll get better every year if and only if you stick to it. And effective feedback. Feedback being one of the most high leverage tools in the teacher's toolbox. But feedback is not just any old feedback. Feedback has to meet several criteria that is really necessary for us to be effective. And that's feedback that is accurate, feedback that's specific, that's timely. And I fear that a great deal of feedback going on in schools today does not meet those criteria. This is not the time for a long disquisition on grading, but I will just tell you, if you think that your grades are effective feedback, take a look at your AP grades, for example, and tell me that everybody who's getting 4s and 5s on advanced placement tests also is getting A's and B's in the class. Every time, bar none, I look at the data, I find students that are getting 4s and 5s on an AP exam. They can do university work, but getting a C or a D in the class because they're missing work. Obviously, the work that they are missing wasn't relevant to getting a 4 or 5. Even more sinister are the kids who are getting A's and B's in class, but they're not proficient. That is the fallacy of the honor roll that I've written about that says we are rewarding kids, particularly our young women, for exactly the wrong thing. Not for being competent, but for being compliant. So we've got to have accurate and specific feedback, professional learning communities, nonfiction writing. Notice it's a pretty short list. So if we're going to have leverage, then we got to decide what not to do. So let me be specific. One of the things that the impact insight process will help you do is to identify initiatives that you're not even using. And every time I'm in schools, I'll find initiatives where people are paying licensing fees. They're paying for training. They're paying for materials and nobody is using them. The fastest and easiest money you can save is stop spending money on things that people aren't using. And there's not a single exception. High performing and low performing schools and everything in between, I always find initiatives that are consuming money and time that are not being used, and as a result, do not have any impact on student achievement. What about worksheets? You and I have spent decades learning about the value of collaborative and interactive classroom assignments, and yet I find worksheets that are, I'm not kidding, 20 years old. Teachers buying from teachers, the website that everybody seems to love is a worksheet factory, and I want to respectfully submit that may be a way to maintain placidity and order, but it is not a way that actually increases learning in the classroom beyond a very elemental way to get going. What about our meetings? Leaders, I want to challenge you on this. There's only two purposes for meeting. One is deliberation and inquiry, where our collective wisdom really helps us learn more, perform better, make better decisions. And the other is information and sharing. Think of the last meeting that you were in. How much of it was really deliberation and inquiry, divergent thinking, alternative points of view, different sources of research that led us to serious inquiry and a better decision, and how much of it was announcements? In my experience, most cabinet meetings, most department meetings, certainly most staff meetings, are all about information and sharing. My rule is sing happy birthday to last week's birthday folks and call it good. Everything else can be in an email. Announcing instructions with orally is just plain primitive these days. You don't have to do it that way. And I know what you're thinking, but if I don't tell them in a meeting, they might not read it in the email. Can I suggest even when you announce it in an email or announce it in a meeting, they might not get it either. There's all kinds of instructional units unrelated to essential knowledge. People cling to these things, and at some point we have to, what I've described as power standards, those few standards that actually have leverage, have endurance, are most essential for the next level of learning. That's where we need to focus. All these peripheral things are not helping students get ahead, except to sometimes have people demonstrate their mastery of a subject that they particularly like. That's great. I'm happy people are masters of their subjects. But if it's not helping students advance to the next level of learning, then it's more of an exercise in a demonstration of knowledge than it is the acquisition of understanding. Observations not accompanied by feedback. I am dreadfully worried about the number of observations happening around the United States right now that are what I might call three blind men of the elephant. People troop in and out of classrooms, stroking their chins wisely, attempting to make observations, and the teacher has no idea what they are seeing, nor sometimes do the observers, because at the end of the day, they don't agree about what they've seen. A far better approach is a simplified one-page rubric where we can identify specifically what we're looking for and what we saw, and the teacher within minutes has immediate feedback as to what they saw. Moreover, the teacher is part of that process, so they can say, here's what I thought was going on at the same time. If you're bogged down in the quicksand of unending observations, call them what you will, whether they're rounds or observations or any number of other terms, and they're not leading to immediate and specific feedback to the teachers, stop doing them. And all kinds of conversations that are focused on venting and complaining and psychotherapy. I'm particularly worried about those of you who are engaged in coaching, and there's not a clear definition of what coaching is. I think coaching has a very clear purpose, which is to close the gap between practice and goals with a systematic process of feedback. Whether that's instructional coaching or leadership coaching, we're always comparing what our practice is to what our goals are and providing feedback to close that gap. I'll tell you what it's not amateur psychotherapy. And I'm worried that an awful lot of things that are called coaching don't fall into that category. So here's how we're going to get a handle on initiative fatigue. We have to beware of the siren call of best practices, because the first best practice looks like this, a shiny diamond. And then the next one, a few more pebbles, but I can handle. These are the markers that you sometimes see in the Pacific Northwest left by Native nations. However, once I get beyond the diamond, once I get beyond the Native nation markers, it'll tell me the direction of where I'm going. Then one after another, I've just got a big pile of rocks. And maybe there's a diamond in there somewhere, but nobody can find it because it's one best practice piled on top of another, piled on top of another. And as a result, teachers are buried under this mountain of rocks and nothing gets done. So the problem with best practices work is that people are afraid to call out worst practices. Don't tell me what a best teaching practice is if you won't tell me what a worst practice is. For example, if you want to tell me, Doug, I want you to engage in no opt-out in the classroom, or I want you to have random calling on students, that means, Doug, stop calling on people with their hands raised, because raising hands to answer questions is a worst practice. Calling on people randomly or cold calling is a best practice. Define not just what a best practice is, but a worst practice. If you believe that rubric-based feedback is a best practice, then say, Doug, as a result, don't ever hand student work back with a number or a letter on it without feedback telling them how they can get better. If you believe that the purpose of feedback is to improve student learning, and I want to encourage students to respond to feedback, then a worst practice would be one-shot assessments and you're done. A worst practice would be using the average to punish students for their later drafts based upon the mistakes of their early drafts. So call out worst practices, not just best practices. And no matter how good a best practice might be, if it's on top of 50 others, it doesn't make any difference. The evidence I accumulated from more than 200 school plans suggests the following. You can get some impact with initiatives in about the first 5 or 6, but once you get beyond 5, 6, 7 initiatives, you can have more and more initiatives, as the horizontal axis here suggests, but you have a diminishing return in terms of an impact on student results. So the reason this is true is that any initiative you have is only as good as your ability to monitor the implementation of it. And you can't monitor more than about half a dozen things. I think, for example, let's go back to our literacy example. You can have some effective look-fors for Reader's Workshop and Writer's Workshop. And you can go to every classroom and say, are we implementing the fundamental principles, characteristics, and teaching practices of Reader's and Writer's Workshop? But if that is a piece of 7 or 8 other literacy initiatives you're trying to do, then none of them are going to get effectively monitored and implemented. And when that happens, all you'll have is frustration and antagonism. Let me illustrate with an example. Here's a district that said they thought that they were focused because these represented the principals and the superintendents and senior administrators' priorities. And I believe them. They believe in PLCs, so do I. Balanced literacy and Read 180, Readers and Writers Workshop, all fine things. But when we surveyed the teachers about what they had, here's what the teachers said. One on top of another, on top of another. And since I originally did this survey, I've had the opportunity to replicate this in many other systems. And even in systems smaller than this one, we found dozens, scores of initiatives, 40, 50, 60, when the administration thought that there were only 6 or 7. And so when you try to get focused, it's not enough for senior leaders to articulate their focus. They have to understand what teachers believe their focus is as well. So here's the findings in a study that I did of more than 2,000 school plans, where I found some schools had as many as 70 priorities, a district with more than 200. And Michael Fullen, who wrote the introduction to this study, said, when you have more than 6 priorities, it becomes a counterproductive waste of time. So here's what the evidence said. Of all the things that lead to better achievement in more than these 2,000 schools, these are the top ones. Efficacy, the bone deep belief that our teaching and leadership matters. And the way that you can assess efficacy is to simply ask your colleagues what causes achievement. And if they say things, well, gosh, it's stuff like we learned today, professional learning communities and high expectations and nonfiction writing and effective feedback. Let them go on, because those are all things that you and I control. That's efficacy. If by contrast they say, oh, what causes student achievement? It's having alcohol and drugs in the home. It's having inattentive parents, lousy nutrition, staying up all night watching video games because the parents don't enforce bedtime. In other words, I'm just a potted plant here. It's all about what happens outside the school walls. That's a definition of a lack of efficacy. Now, friends, I'm not naive. I know that reality is a combination of both these things. In fact, there is there are home factors, including access to technology at 3 o'clock in the morning, not to mention alcohol, tobacco, and drugs that diminish student achievement. But there's a whole lot of things that you and I do during the school day that have a dramatically positive effect on achievement. Efficacy just means that the things in that category, things you and I influence and control, are greater than the things that we can't influence and can't control. The second characteristic was prioritization. Those people who had 6 or fewer high priority initiatives did dramatically better than those who did not. They had goals that were specific and measurable, and they monitored. But they didn't just monitor the kids. Everybody monitors the kids. Test scores are all over every wall, including the unfortunately named war rooms all around the country, all around the world. But real effective monitoring has to do with monitoring what the adults are doing. And here are the results. 3 years of data in reading, writing, science, math, and social studies, elementary, middle, and high school. That's on the vertical axis here. So you can see on the left-hand side, those are the people that were lowest in efficacy, in prioritization, specificity, monitoring, and so on, losing more than 17% over 3 years, all the way to the right, gaining more than 11%. Friends, that's not just statistical significance, that's practical significance, and this stuff really matters. Now, how about the highest performing schools? I know we have some really high performing schools viewing this webinar, and you may think this doesn't really apply to me. Even the highest performing of these 2,000 schools almost tripled their gains over 3 years if they got good at efficacy, prioritization, specificity, measurability, and monitoring. And what about the low performing schools? This is tragic. Largely high poverty schools that were losing ground dramatically every year. They had to get really good at those 5 things: efficacy, prioritization, specificity, measurability, monitoring, just to break even. So we found that once you've got more than 6 priorities, it's inversely related to student achievement. The essence of today's seminar is you got to take some stuff off the plate to get down to 6 priorities. You got to get 90% faculty participation. That'll get you dramatically better gains. But you know what? You don't have to get to 100%. And way too many administrators I know are trying to beat that last 10% senseless to get to 100%. Forget about it. Get to 90%, declare victory, and move on. And finally, remember, it's not about what you buy. It's not about programs. It's about practices, what we actually do. So here's an exercise that you can take away from today's seminar. It's called the not to-do list. And here's the rules for the not to-do list. You think small. Think about saving 5 minutes here. Think about saving 3 minutes in a transition. Think about eliminating morning announcements 3 times a week. It seems like a little bit here, but 3 minutes here, 5 minutes there, gosh, it's only half an hour a day. It's only 2.5 hours a week. It's only multiply that by the number of weeks you've got. We're talking about saving 40, 50, 60 hours of instruction a few minutes at a time. And if you do this, weed your own garden. Principals, don't ask your faculty to do this if you're not willing to weed the garden by canceling a meeting or 2, canceling some announcements, taking some things off the plate. And let me tell you this, the end of the school year always comes. So you may think, as I'm always told, well, I can't think of anything to stop doing. Yes, you can, because the end of the year will come and there will be things you didn't get done. That's what I would call your unconscious not to-do list. I think you are better served by a conscious not to-do list, because the truth is we'll never get everything done. The only question is, are the things that we take off the table by design or by default? And here's the biggest challenge. We have people on this call that serve high poverty schools, high second language schools, high special ed schools. And our research shows that those are the schools that are least likely to have high levels of focus, not because of any malice, but because everybody's out there trying to help you. So here are the next steps that you can take away from today. First of all, decide if you suffer from initiative fatigue. Maybe you only have 6 initiatives and you're already highly focused. You'd be the only school district in the world that I've encountered if that's true. And consider if there's an easy consensus about what to stop doing. I'd hope so. Although what I found is that even when it ought to be an easy consensus, gee, nobody's using this, let's stop spending money and time on it, there'll be 1 or 2 hangers-on that'll say, but we still need this. Or perhaps the person who advocated the purchasing decision in the first place that'll say we still need it. Don't fall victim to that. If people aren't using it, if it's not influencing on student achievement, pull the plug. Have a funeral if you've got to, but pull the plug. And have a conversation about this simple 3-step process. Have an inventory, develop the rubrics, and then assess degree of implementation. I could help you do that, perhaps with a video conference call or maybe even a personal visit if you think that would be useful. I want to once again invite you to our Creative Leadership Summit in Boston, Mass, June 26th through 28th. And before we adjourn, I'm going to check real quick to see if we have questions. So bear with me for just 30 seconds, and I'll check our question list. Just one, and that is, how can we learn more about the actual implementation of Impact Insight, and can we see a sample report? Yeah, we're actually happy to share that. We've done these all over the country, and if you'd like to see an example of how schools really use this, I'll be happy to share with you some examples of a sample rubric as well as what a report looks like. It's very straightforward. Remember, 3 steps. What's the inventory? What's the range of implementation for each initiative? And then what's the impact on implementation and student achievement? So if you'd like to see a sample of that, I'm more than happy to share it with you. I want to thank you for joining us today. You can always reach me individually, either by Twitter, by email, or by the text number that I gave you. Thanks so much for taking time to join us today. Looking forward to seeing you again. In the meantime, if you want the latest videos, articles, blogs, and other resources, they're all free. Go to creativeleadership.net. Would be happy to spend time with you to learn more about your needs. Just give me a call anytime. Have a great rest of the day.